In this lecture, we'll be taking a closer look at Standard Burmese, or the language that is commonly spoken throughout the modern country of Myanmar, which was really established as its own independent nation in 1948. Common Burmese is one of many languages that is spoken in this part of Southeast Asia, but it is the official language for this nation state. Now, within this particular Southeast Asian nation, there are a number of ethnic groups, and many of these ethnic groups are classified and categorized by two things. First, their point of origin, if they are a population that is influenced by surrounding groups, so the Chinese who speak Mandarin, for example, in modern Burma, of course, are connected to the history and some of the migrations that occurred along that Myanmar Chinese border in the kind of north eastern portion of the nation state. But then there are a number of ethnic populations that have their own unique languages, and Naga is one of them. So when you take a look at Nagaland and where that is located, we in this case recognize at least 10 different dialects of this language that is being spoken in kind of northern portions of this nation state. Lao is one of them. Tangul, of course, is the other that we took a look at as well. Now, in terms of other major ethnic populations, the Chin people have a number of different dialectical kinds of language communities in modern Myanmar. The Matu, for example, and the Mara are both Chin speakers. We have, in this case, the Palong people who are also pretty well known among anthropologists or within anthropological circles. Again, three kind of subgroups of Palong are identified for this region and organized, as is the case with many of the populations, along some of these important natural waterways that connect to the coast. There are Hmong speakers in modern Myanmar. And then when we take a look at the Karen people, there are at least 8 or 9 dialects of the Karen language, which is being spoken as well. But in this lecture, we're going to focus on Burmese just because it is a very good example of a non-Indo-European language tradition. It has its own unique system of writing and, of course, its own unique phonology. And it is something that is very commonly spoken throughout Southeast Asia, but then is very concentrated in modern Myanmar. In this case, spoken by over 50 million individuals worldwide. When we take a look at the waterways, which really gave rise to a lot of the civilizations that archaeologically are known to have existed throughout Southeast Asia, the Irrawaddy and the Chindawan river systems are very important for not only the cash crops and the agricultural economies that are common to this part of the world, but these river systems not only, well, they connect, in this case, the entire environment, including reaching up into portions of northeastern India, and in this case, China as well, and connecting all of the different populations in this environment. And of course, historically, we've seen this contribute to trade relationships and, of course, cultural contact. We've seen some commingling of language traditions in this area, but then we've also seen quite a bit of kind of state building in the environment and some pretty significant conflicts as well. Now, in terms of spoken standard Burmese, there are at least five different dialects of the language that are identified as currently being spoken throughout the region, and they are, again, as we saw with Tangul and of course the larger Naga group, they are very much regionalized into this area. So where people live is very much an aspect of the kind of language that they're speaking, and of course the history of that language tradition. And you have to think of these as kind of concentrated areas where language proliferates, or a dialect of a language proliferates. In terms of the colonial history, Myanmar or Burma cannot be separated out from this particular phenomenon. When you think about, in this case, the British colonial period, which was probably or had the strongest impact on politics in the area, um, spoken languages in the area, diversity in the area, and of course interactions between ethnic populations. This was is a big part of the history of the region. But we also see some pretty strong influences coming from China as well. And that was another thing that we saw with the Naga group, specifically Tanggul, that there are, you know, Lao, Hao, and other Chinese ethnic phenomena that are definitely impacting how people speak their own language, the traditions that they retain, and of course, even physical qualities that people have in terms of their genotype. They have a pretty significant admixture of Chinese ethnicity and Chinese genetic racial traits in their own physical makeup as well. So we see a lot of different cues with regard to Chinese contact and colonial contact, as I said, in the Northeast. Of the colonial contact that we associate with Southwest China, the Yish language group is probably the most strongly expressed in the region. One very important consideration then that we have to make as we're looking at Standard Burmese language and some of the other languages being spoken in these watershed environments is how they have preserved themselves. And as anthropologists, we're always looking for that quality of life which seems to be so influential that no matter what level of colonization or assimilation is occurring within and associated with a population, what factor of their culture is a strong preserving agent for their language. And when we were looking at Naga, in this case Naga Tagul, we realized that it was chant and song, and very much in terms of social institutions, households and families that ultimately, child rearing being an aspect of this, were responsible for preserving the language. Now, when we move into and throughout Southeast Asia and the Irrawaddy region, we realize that not only the deep and ancient history is a preserving agent, but in this case, religion seems to be a very, very strong agent for maintaining a standard or a standardized expression of modern Burmese. Now, when you look at religious texts, and the Poyu and the Mon languages are ceremonial religious languages that are still very much expressed in this case Burmese, and in fact probably were major agents in preserving how Burmese is being spoken today. Probably something that is I would say a competitor to these two religious language traditions, which are principally written, is Pali. Pali is another language that has been very important in maintaining linguistic traditions in this part of the Indian subcontinent. Pali, P-A-L-I, in terms of its phonetic spelling, along with Pyo and Mon, are languages that for the most part are religious and have a religious application. So in the case of Pali, we know that this is something that is associated with the writing traditions of Theravada Buddhism, or a particular brand of Buddhism. And it's something that has been preserved in Buddhist texts. And in fact, the ceremonial texts themselves have come to be referred to as Pali for this very reason. But Pyo and Mu are also traditions, written religious traditions that in their phonology and of course in the writing system itself, this is something that very much has preserved a Burmese tradition in light of all of this social and political change. So the core phonology, the morphology of the Burmese language today, and what would be considered to be common Burmese, is preserved in both Buddhist traditions, but then of course because of its close proximity to a variety of regions within the Indian subcontinent, not to mention India itself, we realize that there's also a strong Brahmin tradition that also, with regard to modern and ancient inscriptions, has actively preserved this particular language tradition, even in its spoken form. In terms of when we see these religious inscribed linguistic practices emerging, of course, when you're talking about Pali in general, this is something that can really be dated back to the 5th or 6th century. But we also recognize that these other language traditions, which are also part of more of a kingdom age in Burma, prior to, in this case, the British colonial period, we know that there were a series of kingdoms which were important to the region. There was even with regard to the local watershed system, there were upper and lower expressions of kingdoms, and you could spend an entire course just going over the various developing agriculturally rooted states, and then of course the kingdoms that were, and city-states that were developing out of these. But again, if you think about the history of the region, we have mongrel invasions occurring really in the 14th, 16th centuries, or at or around that period of time. Before that invasion, that initial invasion of the region, we had a series of kingdoms that were indigenous to the Irrawaddy watershed, being kind of the principal watershed and the principal system for agriculture and what we would see as kind of regular annual flooding periods where the rice economy, for example, in terms of an important locally domesticated crop, was able to thrive and rise up in and support these developing state systems. So we had, kind of an upper and lower expression of a kingdom system prior to the Mongol invasions, and then the Mongol invasions occurred, and then following that, we see the rise of this kind of blended, almost Chinese influence that is being shared and is working its way through the region. And then, of course, as we move into the 19th century, we see the rise of the British colonial age. And this kind of Anglo-Burmese period, which ends with, or at least in this case ends with independence and the creation of what was initially a democratic nation in the late 1940s, and then of course the rise of a more military state near the end of the modern kind of 20th century period, 1960s and beyond. So it was the religious languages of the region, religions and religious traditions that were not necessarily localized to one developing nation state or one particular watershed, that really allowed for languages to be preserved in this area, and why we see still a well-developed ethnic diversity being expressed throughout modern Myanmar as well. even with strong and surrounding colonial forces associated, of course, with the English, the Dutch, and the French, who are the kind of the primary colonizers in this part of Southeast Asia. The wars of independence in the 19th century were very, very important. What was happening in India was very much spreading throughout mainland Southeast Asia, and of course even working its way out into the Pacific as well. And these were things that, again, the languages persisted through. And it was a return to the languages of Burma itself that we see at the end of the 20th century. And of course, the Burmese language today is the language that is most common to the region and is the national language, as I said before, of the region, and this socialist kind of party that now controls most of what is modern Myanmar. Now, for our purposes this week and throughout this lecture, we will be looking at the alphabet, and we'll be looking specifically at consonants. We'll dabble a little bit into vowels and a little bit into grammar, but we'll focus most of our study on this phenomenon known as abukida, or in the Burmese language, which has no translation to English, but it is, or it represents, it's an expression that represents their alphabet. The Burmese alphabet is a pretty large one, 33 consonants, some of which express this kind of consonant-vowel blend. And that's really where this term abukida is originating from. So some of the consonants, some of the phonemes that we'll be looking at are actually more morphemes in the sense that they are pronounced with a vowel attached. And we'll see this also in how these particular phonemes, these particular aspects of abukida, or the Burmese alphabet, how they are in a sense being used in words and sentences. So in the case of a t sound, for example, we recognize that generally it is always going to be, I have often here, but really it's always going to be paired with an ah sound as well, so da. And it might sound to you when you're listening to some of the expressions as being a ba or a da, but in reality it has more of that kind of aspired velar expression that we see in our own traditions, if your traditions are represented by American Standard English, so that t sound is not something as distinct, it is blended in a sense, it's da. In terms of the k sound, which again is a velar sound or consonant in American Standard English, where we can pronounce it more as a k sound, we aspire a little bit there. But in the case of abukida, this is more of a ga sound. And again, it's hard to hear that distinct k or k as it's being pronounced. Ga is an expression meaning to dance. Now, when you see the word ga for dance, very often you will see it written with an that is also connected to that, and that can be that'll be something that we'll talk about a little later, but the idea here is that you're adding the formally to make it ga for dance. But in terms of how a modern Burmese speaker would identify ga in their own alphabet, it's going to include that sound automatically. So what is the takeaway here? Generally, when we think about Burmese phonemes, they are considered to be vowel dependent. Okay, what I've got here is kind of the last bulleted point. It seems a little bit complicated and maybe a little bit confusing when you look at it, but basically it's all of the different consonants that we're looking at here kind of strung together, and I'm going to take you through each one. I'm going to give you some examples of words that these consonants and their pronunciations are associated with, starting out with the symbol gachi, right, pronounced ga, which we talked a little bit about already. There will be a aspired, unaspired chart that is associated with this lecture that I would like you to have near you as we're working through these kind of consonants step by step. And I'll make reference to particular coordinates or locations in that chart as we're kind of moving left to right and then down. So go ahead and take a moment. You could even pause the video for just a brief moment here and then pull that resource out, have that available to you as we work our way through these consonants, starting with gachi. So when you look at the upper left-hand corner of your consonant groups, you will note that you're dealing initially with a group of gutturals, and the guttural that we associate with the, I guess it would be an expression of k in our own language, but it would be again more of a ga in Burmese, is represented by kaji. Kaji is also written for you next to a phonetic expression or spelling, gaji, and is associated with that first written symbol. It almost appears to be kind of two kind of circles, one broken at the base, the other broken slightly off-centered and then connected. And the accompanying video, there's two videos that will accompany this lecture, will take you through how each of these consonants are written, and then it will start to introduce you to how vowels are either added or stacked above or below these particular consonants. So gaji is our first consonant, and it has a sound of ga. It's an unaspired guttural. And remember, because these particular sounds are paired more often than not, or always, with some sort of vowel sound, they also will appear as words in their own right in the Burmese language, ga being a verb for dancing or to dance. The vocalized ah sound is something that, if you're looking at your chart, if you're to go down to an ungrouped expression, and really the very last row in that chart, you see the ah sound. It's the last expression there. If you're looking at it through the lens of our kind of American standard eyes, it looks almost like a 3 with a B that's slightly bent and connected to the 3. That's a vowel. It's ah, right? That is something that's not added to the ga in gaji, but it is, in a sense, pronounced. It's present there. All right, the second, in this case, aspired consonant that we'll be looking at is gakui. Gakui is, or appears, in that first row of your chart, and it's the second consonant over under the label or the header aspired, gakui. Now, in terms of how we pronounce gakui, gakui is going to be pronounced in a way that sounds a lot like gachi. So gachi was ga, right? And this is going to be pronounced ka. Now it sounds very, very similar, but in this case the g sound is removed. It's almost as if you, in American Standard English, just take a k sound and put an a on the end of it. So it doesn't have a g in the middle, so it doesn't go ka, right, like we would have with a g in there, ka. It's more of a ka. Kanye is the third consonant. In this case, it is voiced, and you can see the symbol again that represents it in the Burmese alphabet in that third column in the first row. And in this case, it's going to have a GA sound, but less guttural and aspired, so it's going to be more ga. The actual symbol itself is referred to as ganye. So ganye in that third column on the top is ga. Next we have gaji. So if you take a look at that fourth column and you compare the pronunciation, the phonetic pronunciation below the symbol, slightly to the right, to the first column, gaji, with a K sound. Now we have, so that's in the first column for ga. If you go all the way to the fourth column, top, gaji. Sounds very, very similar, but it's more of a g sound than a k sound. All right, now the fifth column, the column labeled nasal, or the nasal sounds, we have kind of an interesting consonant here. So if you think of a word like running in our linguistic tradition, the ng at the end is the sound that we're hearing here, the na, right? But it has that G that's built into it, like ng, right? Na. And this is unique because the pronunciation, na, and the actual Burmese expression for that written symbol, which almost looks like a C to us, na, is the same. And what makes this very different from how na is being used in a word like sing, even though you don't hear the ah built into that. How that's used in Burmese, if you think of the word salt, which would be nha, that expression meaning salt, or sometimes it can be used as an adjective, salty, or it's something that's salty to the taste, nha. That is using that na on the front end of the word itself. Okay, so now we'll switch down to the second layer. These are the palatals, and in this case, salon will be in the first column that's unaspired. So salon is the name of the symbol, za, almost like a TZS or TS. If you have ever studied Hebrew, tza is one of the consonants there. This is a tza, right? They add the sound to that. And this, again, is zalon. Next, we have tzale. And I write it out here as tzalain, but it would be tzale. And that's in the second column. It is aspired. Again, second row in terms of these palatals. Tzalain. The next two sounds, again, moving from left to right, so this would be the third column, second row, voiced. You'll notice that in the phonetic portion of that column, they have the same symbol, which would be a z sound. And that's basically two consonants that are used in different ways, different expressions, that have this z sound to them as they're being pronounced. Tsagwe is the first one. That would be in the third column, second row. Tsagwe. And if you think of an expression for shovel, zon, that's they use that symbol at the heart or at the start of how that word is being written. It can be applied to the word spoon as well. Zon. The other letter to its right, again, this would be the fourth column, zaminzue, zaminzue, which is pronounced z, zaminzue. The next sound, nya, nya. I have it kind of written out for you as NYA in terms of how that consonant is pronounced. Na, right? Nya. And that would be under the nasal group as well. It is a palatal. This particular consonant appears in a color like brown, nyo, no. It would be kind of a nya, but with an o vowel added to it. All right, we'll swing back over to the first column, the unaspired column, and we'll start looking at some of the avelar sounds in the alphabet system here. Tatalinche is the first unaspired t sound. And then we also have an aspired T sound as well, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So Tatalinche is the first one. Now this is hard to distinguish when it's being pronounced in Burmese because it's a ta, okay? Because they're adding that ah sound to it, ta. Whereas you or I in American Standard English would say t, but this is ta. So Tatalinche is the unaspired ta, ta, ta. Next to this we have the aspired ta, ta, ta. This is Tawumbe, the symbol, Tawumbe, ta. Again, think of it as using air or not using air. So if something is unaspired, we are not using any sort of major airflow in the kind of the vocal area, whereas when we're dealing with aspired, we have ta, ta. We aspire as part of it. We don't hold that back. And that's the difference here between Tatalinche and Takumbe, right? Those are the two symbols, very similar when you kind of look at them, but one is unaspired and one is aspired. Now the next two on our chart in rows 3 and 4, or in columns rather, 3 and 4, and we're in those avelars, that's the kind of third row down, we have a vocalized da sound, da. The first is da yingat and da ji mo. So take a look at the two pronunciations just below the symbols and the da that we have in terms of the phonetic spelling there to the right, da jinga and da ji mo. Now in the last column, again third row down, we have na ji, and again it's pronounced as na. So na ji, na, a nasal sound as a consonant. All right, if we go back over to the unaspired column again, and we take a look at the dentals and then the labials, a lot of these are very, very similar, and so we'll kind of move through these at a little bit of a faster rate. Again, just because you're not going to be necessarily tested on these particular sounds, but it is important that you know the different variation in sounds associated with the Burmese alphabet. So in terms of the dentals, then we have Tawumbu, which is a t, 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 Tawumbu. That's the unaspired T sound. Again, another unaspired T sound. Tashimbu, which would be more of the da, da, da. A little bit of a different sound again, but similar to what we had with the Dawimbe, so Tashibu. Then we have, in terms of our voiced dentals, we have a d, d, dakwe, dakwe, d, d, under the dentals. Next you'll see Daotea, which is that, again, voiced dental. It's pronounced identical to what we had with dakwe, d, d, but it's just where it's being pronounced in the oral cavity. It's closer to the alveolar region, the teeth, the dental arcade, and it is, in a sense, utilizing those teeth more readily. Then we have naye, again, pronounced nearly the same as what we had with naji. It will have a n sound, again nasal, but it's a different symbol. Then we move to the labial consonants. We have pajo or ba, right? Pajo is ba, so it's going to have a pa sound, almost like a PA in terms of how it would be pronounced. That's unaspired, uh, first column again, and it's the first section of the labial sounds in this alphabet. So it is that, in this case, fifth row. All right, then the aspired pa. It has more of an H added to it. Pa, pa. This padatu is the symbol here. Pa, pa. That's the second column in that labial row there. And as you are pronouncing these, again, you're bringing your lips together. Pa, pa, or pa, pa. But you've got to bring those lips together in order to pronounce those. If we take a look then at the next two columns, working through the labials, basically they're pronounced the same way. So ba'itai is going to be ba, and bagone is going to be ba. So both of those in the vocalized labials of this alphabet are going to be both pronounced ba, ba. And then the last one that we'll focus on as part of this lecture is that last labial sound ma, and it's pronounced the same way, ma, ma. Again, focusing more on the kind of nasalized sound that we associate with, in this case, the use of the lips, those labials, but then utilizing, in terms of the airflow, that nasal cavity as well. So this gives you a kind of a general overview of, in this case, the phonology of the Burmese language tradition. With regard to vowels and vowel phonemes, it's important to remember that there are additionally 8 sounds that are associated with vowel structure in the Burmese language. On the course website, there is a 4-part series on writing vowels. These are very, very short films or videos, but they should be something that accompanies your examination of the writing of a Bukida. And what you will find is that vowels are additions, right? They're adding symbols to, in this case, the developed symbol for the consonant. Sometimes they'll stack above and below, sometimes to the right, sometimes to the left. And so you'll see how these 8 vowels, these vowel phonemes, are, in this case, being pronounced and how they are being written in the language. So make sure to look at that as well. We will turn our focus next to verbs and nouns. Verbs and nouns, in a sense, show no overlap in the Burmese language. What we realize is that nouns generally in Common Burmese are derived for the most part from the verbs themselves. So how the speaker pronounces a particular expression, or how they will repeat or even have a beat-like chant to how they are formulating a word, will move that expression out of the area of being an object, a noun of some sort, a subject, to something that is an action word or a verb. So the example I have here is an expression, yapayaka, right? Which translates, I have to, or speech, but really it translates better to the word rhyme or chime. It's a more of a poetic kind of form of speech. Now, if you take this particular word, in this case, bayaka, and you add sto to the end, now it translates to speaker, or an individual who is speaking. So you take the verb to rhyme, to chime, to speak, and then you add sto to the end, which literally the sto means really more to speak than payacha does. And what you're doing there is you're almost saying, oh, this is a rhyme, now I am speaking the rhyme. And so it goes from in a sense, the act of rhyming or speaking to the person doing that act. And that's really, in a sense, how nouns and verbs relate to one another in the Burmese language. Another way to look at this, tsewa, to think, or I am, I'm thinking about something. Tsechi uh, is the thinkers. You're adding that chi on the end, and that creates the noun, in a sense, out of the verb. So to think being or in relation to the person thinking or the thinker. Adverbs follow a similar kind of process. When you take a look in Common Burmese at adverbs within their lexicon, what you realize is that through processes of repetition, uh, prefixation, or kind of rhyming or chanting, in a sense, the verb becomes an adverb. So it is very much of a kind of a derived process for adverbs as well. So verbs in Burmese are extremely important. They give rise to both the nouns, and then some of the things that are modifying them are associated with them in some contextual way, like an adverb would. Then, with regard to sentence structure and grammar, Burmese will be read left to right. However, we do have this compounding effect with regard to the script itself and vowels and how those are structured. But again, the logic of the language, the kind of cognitive map for the grammar of the language is nearly identical to what we see in a Indo-European language, a Romantic language such as English. With regard to pronouns, generally first and second pronouns, things like na, ma, nin, min, these are, he, his, she, her. These will be used in a similar fashion. However, like Nepalese, which we looked at very early in the lecture series, pronoun choices will generally be things that will distinguish people in terms of their age, their sex, and of course their social status. Social status in terms of their status as it relates to the speaker in this case. So similarities in terms of the kind of cognition, the thought processes behind the grammar and sentence structure, but some differences with regard to word choice and this notion of honorifics and diglossia, and then being able to distinguish individuals according to their age, their sex. These are important, unique qualities to the Burmese language. Sociolinguist and cultural anthropologist Mary Haas in the late 1960s studied kinship terminology and honorifics in and throughout Southeast Asia. She studied, in this case, languages being spoken in Thailand, and then she also took a look at languages being spoken in Burma or Myanmar. And she realized, as is the case with what we've seen in uh, Laura Ahern's work, that languages in this region, and especially languages to the north of this region, will distinguish individuals as they relate to the speaker linguistically. And so people who are kin relatives by blood and relatives who are affiliated with one another through marriage, they will be distinguished with particular kinds of kin expressions. So she found that people who were related to a speaker by blood were referred to in a more formal manner than those who were being identified as an in-law or as somebody who is related to an individual through, in this case, marriage. She found an exception to this in the form of sibling terms. In this case, there would be particular kinds of terms of endearment that would be applied to siblings, and this would fall outside of some of those honorifics, and it would show a different kind of relationship between people who are of the same generation, or at least the same general level within their kinship calculation, and individuals who would, of course, be born from the same kind of natal household or the same family structure. Terms that were applied to siblings may be applied also to very close marriage ties, specifically wives and husbands. So she was able to also distinguish, uh, or she recognized in this case, that honorifics were being extended or were being applied in this case to individuals further from the more nucleated aspects of the family structure among Burmese speakers. So individuals who were, let's say, blood relatives of a sibling nature and individuals who were, in this case, spouses, were treated linguistically the same. So what she found, and she also saw this in other locations in some of the surrounding languages found in Taiwan and in Thailand, that let's say an individual who was an older brother, that the linguistic terms that would be applied to an older brother, how you would describe that individual, would also be applied to a sweetheart or a husband. Um, the same goes with a younger sister. So if you were male and you were speaking about a younger sister, the terminology there would be synonymous to your sweetheart or your wife. So the idea here is that when we see this overlap in kinship terminology, we would also see, in a sense, similar kinds of relationships. The closeness that exists between, in this case, an older brother and a younger sister is something that would be kind of a template or an archetype socially and linguistically for that intimate relationship between spouses. So the kind of relationship that you had in terms of closeness between yourself and your sibling would translate to how you would model the same kind of relationship in this case, a spouse or committed boyfriend girlfriend kind of relationship in this culture. So if we take a look at a kavnan, a term that means my older brother or relates to how you would describe a brother if the individual was older than you are, male or female, we see this then being used by women as kav, right? It's a there's a repetition to it, but it is formulated around the same kind of core sounds and morphemes, um, and it is an enduring expression to describe husband or boyfriend. So again, that kind of typifies this relationship that Mary Haas was identifying. Now, outside of that natal household structure, things become much more rigid and much more formal when it comes to social status, age, and sex. So when she compared nearby language communities, even what we have in Thailand, age-based terms applied to siblings were not then applied to in-laws. So once you get beyond wife or husband, the honorifics fall off, and you don't necessarily get a language based expression that distinguishes status that is equal or greater than, as we would see with blood, being applied to in laws or relatives that are calculated out through a final ties or through ties of marriage. So, what is the kind of the big takeaway here when we look at the Burmese language? Well, first and foremost, we realize that Common Burmese is the national language of Myanmar, and it is something that has been preserved throughout a pretty tumultuous history, a history of colonization and of warfare. The other piece that we see here being played out is that we have a uniquely non Indo European form of spoken and written language. And it is something that as you study it a little bit more deeply, you'll come to realize is very different from your own system of writing and, of course, your own system of speaking. The last takeaway here that we can identify is that, like the languages that surround where core areas of Burmese are geographically, we see similar kinds of cultures and cultural practices. In this case, with regard to cultural practices, this notion of the language as expressing something having to do with the structure of the society that speaks it. The idea of social status and of age and position as an individual, in this case, relates to a speaker is something that is very much mapped out in how the language is being used. And that's something that can be very much said for most of the common or heavily spoken languages throughout Southeast Asia and within Southern Asia as well, and of course, India.